The narrator entered a bright ballroom that smelled of lilies and polish. Crystal rang like tiny bells as servers drifted between gold chairs. Lucas Vance lifted his glass and owned the room with a lazy smile. Lucas Vance said, "To the Vance name, perfect as ever." Laughter spread like perfume, sweet and quick. Grace Morales stood near a service door and watched the crowd breathe as one creature. Her hand steadied a silver tray that shook once, then stilled. Victor Vance walked in with a gaze that cut the air and closed soft mouths. He did not smile. Mara Chen checked guest cards and kept her eyes sharp and calm. Music rose, and the floor glowed like still water. A glass slipped from the tray and cracked bright on marble. Silence ran fast across stone like ice. Grace Morales said, "Gabriel." The name echoed under gold light and would not die. Lucas Vance blinked once. The narrator felt the night tilt toward a fall. The narrator followed Gabriel Vance through steam and neon at a corner diner that never slept. He wiped a counter until it shone like a small moon in a storm. Plates clinked and coffee hissed in short bursts. Gabriel Vance said, "Put me on the night shift." The owner nodded without looking up from a stack of checks. The door opened and closed, letting rain light in and out like a slow signal. A busboy passed with eyes on the floor. The clock ticked in a stubborn rhythm. The grill popped and sent a thin smoke ribbon toward the ceiling fan. Gabriel Vance counted tips and did not count hope. The narrator felt a name moving through the city's wet streets like a quiet storm that had already chosen its path. The narrator entered the estate office where paper lived like bones in tidy rows. A shred bin hummed in the corner and made the room feel hungry. Mara Chen sorted contracts with neat hands and quiet breaths. Lucas Vance stepped in and set a charity folder on the lip of the machine. He did not read the title or the note attached. Lucas Vance said, "Clear the clutter." The folder tipped and slid down into teeth that glowed red. Mara Chen did not blink or speak. Mara Chen said, "Paper remembers." The hum grew bright and then low again. Outside the door, footsteps paused and moved on at a careful pace. Lucas Vance checked his watch and left the room colder than before. The narrator felt a line of ink burn in the air like a fuse. Victor Vance closed his study doors and built a wall of wood and hush. The narrator heard the lock fall like a small hammer. He stood by the window and watched the rain stop in a clean line. Victor Vance said, "Rumors are pests. Exterminate them." The words were calm and heavy and left no air behind. Lucas Vance laughed with a note that cut rather than warmed. Lucas Vance said, "Already done." The laugh ended too fast. The fire snapped once in the grate and then held its breath. The study smelled of smoke, polish, and old victories. The air did not warm. The narrator counted the seconds until someone would have to speak again. In the small kitchen, the narrator watched Grace Morales hold a locket between finger and thumb. The kettle clicked and went quiet as if agreeing with her thought. She set one cup and then another, though no one had knocked. Grace Morales said, "Not tonight." Silence. Her back straightened, as if a burden stood up with her. A clock ticked slow and patient on a wall with tiny chips. The window showed a blue edge of dawn, though the night was not ready to release its hold. She breathed in deep, and the room seemed to breathe with her. She put on a cardigan and folded a note and pressed it flat with her palm. The narrator felt a choice reach for morning and refused the dark. The narrator stood by the loading dock and watched trucks sigh. The air smelled like rubber and rain. Gabriel Vance held a clipboard and tried to smile. Gabriel Vance said, "I can take extra stops." The vendor looked past him and checked his phone. The vendor said, "Routes changed." A pallet thumped and made a dull echo. A rumor moved here faster than a truck. Gabriel Vance said, "This is about a call." The vendor did not answer. The narrator felt power close a door that had no hinges. A forklift beeped and rolled away. Gabriel Vance set the clipboard down and kept his voice even. Gabriel Vance said, "I will be back." The wind folded his words and took them down the alley. The narrator entered a small legal clinic that hummed like a copy machine. Fluorescent lights made the walls look tired. Grace Morales sat with a folder and a locket. Grace Morales said, "Truth has legs." The lawyer read a form and kept his tone kind. Lawyer Patel said, "We can try a petition." A printer rattled and then slept. Grace Morales said, "I have dates and names." The narrator watched Hope step into a narrow hallway. A clock ticked like careful shoes. Lawyer Patel said, "Bring any records you still hold." Grace Morales nodded and rose with slow care. The room felt larger as she stood. The narrator stood at the estate gate where iron looked like lace. Evening burned low behind the trees. Gabriel Vance pressed the intercom. Gabriel Vance said, "I request a meeting." A voice came back smooth and thin. Lucas Vance said, "We do not host stories." Footsteps scraped on gravel. A guard walked from the booth and waited. The air held a clean chill. Gabriel Vance said, "You know my name." The voice did not bend. The narrator felt the gate grow taller without moving. The guard raised a hand and pointed to the street. Gabriel Vance stepped back but did not turn. The narrator followed Victor Vance into a records room that smelled like dust and plastic. Boxes made aisles like a paper maze. Victor Vance said, "Erase anything with her name." An estate clerk unlocked a cabinet. The clerk slid folders onto a cart. The wheels clicked like a metronome. Victor Vance watched the hands move. Victor Vance said, "No backups." The air seemed to cool one more degree. The narrator felt a tide run backward inside the shelves. A label peeled at the edge of a box. The clerk said, "Understood." The room swallowed the word and did not give it back. The narrator stood in the alley behind the diner where neon made rain look like fire. Trash lids clicked in a soft wind. Mara Chen stepped from the shadow with an envelope. Mara Chen said, "Keep this safe." Gabriel Vance took it and did not open it. A crest showed through the paper like a small moon. The street hummed with late buses. Gabriel Vance said, "Why help me?" Mara Chen said. "Paper remembers." The narrator felt a thin bridge appear between two shores. A door slammed somewhere far down the block. The night closed a little, then held. The narrator watched a small apartment breathe with screen light. A fan ticked like a tired watch. Gabriel Vance read a blog that called him a fraud. The headline glared and would not blink. Gabriel Vance said, "Noise is not truth." A neighbor's radio leaked a sad song through a thin wall. A cracked mug cooled on the desk. Rain threaded the window in slow lines. The page refreshed and grew sharper teeth. "What?" Gabriel Vance said, "You do not know me." The cursor blinked like a tiny dare. The narrator felt the room shrink, then hold. The clock moved a minute forward. The city hissed under parked tires. A siren faded to blue memory. Gabriel Vance closed the tab and opened the folder from the diner. Paper breathed like a living thing. He folded one page and set it by the lamp. He said, "I will answer with proof." The night waited for the next beat. The narrator stood in a clinic hallway that smelled like lemon and iron. Fluorescent lights hummed with a flat voice. Grace Morales gripped a rail and swayed. A nurse reached her before the floor did. Nurse Elena said, "Sit with me." A chair rolled from a room and tapped a wall. Grace Morales said, "I am steady." The corridor disagreed and tilted a little. The clock blinked numbers that felt stern. Poster promised care in large letters. The narrator heard the quiet worry of shoes and carts. Nurse Elena said, "Breathe with me." The Heir slowed and followed. Someone laughed far away, then stopped. Grace Morales said, "I must file a paper." The nurse nodded and kept a hand under hers. The hallway leveled. The lights did not soften, yet the moment did. The narrator marked this small, still place and held it. The narrator crossed a terrace where glass walls held a bright noon. Silverware sang in small notes. Lucas Vance spoke to a long table. Lucas Vance said, "Ghosts do not hold shares." A few men smiled like trained dogs. A server set down a bowl and fled the grin. The city stacked behind the glass in clean lines. Steam drifted from cups and made soft halos. A board member tapped a pen like a judge. Lucas Vance said, "We close the rumor today." The narrator watched Pride pose for a camera no one held. A gull cut the sky and left no mark. The server looked at the floor and kept moving. The table laughed too hard and then stopped together. The room felt staged and exact. The narrator filed the moment under brittle. The narrator moved into storage where dust danced in a thin sunline. Boxes stacked into narrow streets. A single fan pushed warm air that went nowhere. Mara Chen opened a ledger and traced one line. The ink looked fresh, though the year was old. Mara Chen said, "Paper remembers." A label on a box peeled like a slow secret. The page carried a small payment marked care. The narrator felt the room lean toward truth. Footsteps paused at the door, then faded like a shy tide. Mara Chen slid the ledger into her satchel. She wiped dust with her wrist and left the surface bright. The fan clicked twice and settled. The air held its breath and let her pass. The narrator waited on courthouse steps as dusk blurred to ink. The stone held a day of heat and let it go slowly. Gabriel Vance climbed the last stair and stopped. He looked at the doors like they were a mouth. Gabriel Vance said, "I stand even if I stand alone." A bus sighed at the curb and pulled away. Pigeons turned once and settled again. A clerk inside snapped a light that drew a square on the floor. The wind moved a paper across the landing and set it by his shoe. Gabriel Vance picked it up and folded it clean. The city dimmed to blue, and then deeper blue. The narrator felt resolve click into place like a key. The narrator entered a hearing room where microphones waited like teeth. The walls held flags and quiet rules. A clerk stacked files in neat towers. Grace Morales rose from a bench and rested a hand on the table. Her breath steadied. The judge watched without moving. The gallery leaned forward as if a tide pulled it. Grace Morales said, "Gabriel Vance is Lucas Vance's brother." The word brother struck the wood and stayed. Chairs creaked, paper slid. Lucas Vance did not blink. Gabriel Vance closed his hand to keep it from shaking. The narrator felt years cross the floor in a straight line. The judge raised a palm for quiet. The room obeyed like a trained choir. The sound that came back was only air. The narrator watched a lawyer glide to the lectern with a silver pen. The voice was calm and sharp. Corporate counsel said, "This claim is born of need, not fact." The gallery rustled like dry leaves. Grace Morales kept her eyes forward. Gabriel Vance folded a page and did not look down. Lucas Vance let a smile touch one corner and vanish. The judge made a small note. Corporate counsel said, "No proof ties these parties by law." The words were smooth, but the air felt rough. The narrator marked how pride can sound like reason until truth arrived. The narrator saw a locket rest on felt like a small sun. A clerk slid an evidence tray forward. Grace Morales opened the hinge with careful fingers. A clinic tag lay inside with a date and a number. The air tightened. Mara Chen stepped near the rail with a folder. Mara Chen said, "Paper remembers." The tag matched the ledger line she carried. Gabriel Vance stared at the metal and did not move. Lucas Vance fixed his gaze on nothing. The judge leaned in to see. The room breathed in and held. The narrator felt the center of the story lock. The narrator watched Mara Chen take the stand. The seat creaked once and went quiet. The oath sounded like a bell with no echo. Mara Chen said, "I saw Victor Vance visit Grace after the birth." The words were plain and heavy. The gallery shifted, then stilled. A pen rolled and tapped a rail. The judge waited. Corporate counsel lifted a brow and wrote a note. Mara Chen kept her voice even. She named a date, a time, and a hallway light that hummed. The narrator felt the room lean toward a door that was finally open. The narrator held the room in a long second. Lucas Vance rose without being called. The chair scraped like a blade on stone. Lucas Vance said, "He was nothing." The words fell and did not break. Gabriel Vance stood and met the stare. The judge rapped once and the sound snapped like dry wood. The gallery pulled back as if from heat. Grace Morales did not look away from her son. Corporate counsel touched a sleeve, but did not speak. The narrator felt the floor tilt, then lock again. The hearing was not over. The center would not move. The narrator followed Victor Vance into a parking garage where voices echoed like coins. Fluorescent lights hummed over concrete that smelled of oil. A man waited by a pillar and watched the ramps. Victor Vance said, "The clinic trail ends." The man nodded once and did not ask why. Tires hissed on a level above and then went quiet. Victor Vance said, "No copies, no loose hands," the man said. "It will be clean." The narrator felt the air thin, as if the garage had fewer walls. A draft came up the ramp and stirred old dust. The meeting was short because the point was sharp. Victor Vance turned first and did not look back. The man stayed in shadow until the steps were gone. The narrator marked the promise like a switch flipped down. The narrator stood by a curb as a truck door creaked open. Cardboard boxes leaned like tired heads. Gabriel Vance folded a jacket and set it on top of a crate. A landlord held a notice as if it were a flag. Landlord said, "Nothing personal." A bus sighed past and sprayed a thin mist. Gabriel Vance said, "I paid what I could." The notice did not change shape. The narrator felt a cold line pass through a warm evening. A neighbor watched from a window and then pulled the shade. Gabriel Vance closed the tailgate and breathed once. He said, "I will keep moving." The street held the words without echo. The truck lights blinked like slow eyes. The narrator entered a pawn shop where glass cases held small stories. Fluorescent strips buzzed above a counter with finger smears. Grace Morales opened her palm and placed a ring on the felt. The pawnbroker lifted a loop and said nothing. Grace Morales said, "This buys a filing." The register clicked like a clock with bad manners. The pawnbroker said, "I can offer enough." The number was not kind, but it was real. The narrator watched Grace Morales nod and sign. She pressed the receipt flat with her hand as if blessing a map. The little bell on the door rang once when she left. The street air felt larger than the room. The narrator waited by a quiet row of cubicles where screens slept. A white envelope sat on Mara Chen's chair with a single word. Mara Chen opened it and read, then folded it once. A phone on a nearby desk vibrated and stopped. Mara Chen said, "Then I keep the key." She slipped a small packet into her satchel and closed the zipper. Footsteps came down the hall and paused at the corner. The room smelled like dust and copier heat. The footsteps went away without a word. Mara Chen powered down her screen and stood straight. The narrator felt courage click like a latch. The narrator stepped into a hotel ballroom dressed as a stage. A media wall shouted logos in tidy rows. Lucas Vance stood at a podium and smiled for the grid of lenses. Lucas Vance said, "Family stands united." Flashbulbs made snow that did not melt. A handler whispered from the wing and held a tablet. Questions rose like birds and circled. Lucas Vance said, "We welcome any review." The voice was smooth, and the smile did not tire. The narrator heard doubt move under the carpet. A camera light flickered and steadied. The room wanted a headline and got one. The narrator stood in a hotel ballroom trimmed like a stage. Cameras blinked in a tight grid. Lucas Vance held a safe smile that did not change. A door opened at the side aisle. A court officer stepped into the light. Court officer said, "Emergency disclosure." Paper rustled like wings. Lucas Vance said, "This is a press briefing." The voice did not slow the order. Reporters leaned in as if pulled by a wire. The narrator felt the room tilt toward a ledge. Victor Vance stared ahead and did not speak. The stage lights hummed like a warning siren. The narrator tracked the aisle as a nurse moved through the bodies. She held a sealed folder and a clear pouch. Nurse Elena said, "I kept a copy off-site." A murmur rolled from the press line. Lucas Vance said, "Chain of custody is broken." The officer stepped closer and lifted the order. The hum from the panels thinned and steadied. Nurse Elena said, "This matches the clinic intake." Victor Vance stared at the pouch like glass could burn. The narrator felt heat gather at the podium edge. The room waited on a zipper and a signature. The narrator watched numbers land like iron. A screen showed the matching clean lines. The judge's seal sat beside the report. Gabriel Vance did not move, but his breath found a beat. Lucas Vance said, "This is theater." The graph did not care about speech. Court officer said, "Entered into record." The room breathed out and then in again. Flashbulbs popped like small storms. The narrator felt pride fall without a noise. Victor Vance held the rail as if the floor had changed shape. The narrator held a close stillness as Grace Morales faced Victor Vance. Stage sound dropped to a soft hum. Grace Morales said, "You taught me silence. I return it never." Victor Vance said nothing and let the words cut. A phone buzzed and stopped. The cameras framed their profiles like coins. Lucas Vance stared at the floor and would not bend. Gabriel Vance stood near the aisle and did not step in. The narrator felt an old room unlock inside the new one. The echo moved through lights, paper, and bone. The narrator climbed with the board to a room of glass and cold light. Screens waited with silent charts. The chair cleared a throat that carried weight. Board chair said, "Motion to suspend pending review." Hands rose like a tide that had learned discipline. Lucas Vance said, "This is a hostile act." The words landed and slid away. Victor Vance watched the votes with a fixed face. The gavel tapped once and drew a thin line across the hour. The narrator felt the building exhale. The city below did not notice. But the room had changed. The narrator stood beneath tall windows while quiet dust drifted. A clerk lifted a stamp and inked the pad. The sound was small, yet it filled the hall. Judge Warren read the order with a steady mouth. The seal shone like a coin. Gabriel Vance did not move, but his breath found a calm step. Clerk said, "Entered." The word landed and stayed. Corporate counsel wrote a note and shut the folder. The narrator felt a line appear where a gap had lived. The door opened to a brighter corridor. Feet tapped, then slowed, then stopped. The hour felt changed, though the clock had not turned. The narrator waited by the curb as hotel doors breathed out cold air. Cameras clicked from far away, then lost interest. Lucas Vance walked to the lane and raised a hand. No car rolled forward. Lucas Vance said, "Move." The word met only wind. A valet looked down and studied his list. A bus sighed. bright inside, and kept going. Lucas Vance lowered his arm and fixed his tie. The knot did not help. The narrator saw pride try to stand on thinner ground. Footsteps passed and did not pause. The night pressed in, and the street stayed wide. The narrator stepped into a small room that smelled like tea and soap. Light touched a vase and turned the water gold. Grace Morales rested on a tidy couch with a blanket on her knees. Mara Chen set flowers on the table and smiled with quiet care. Mara Chen said, "Paper remembered." The words were gentle, not sharp. Grace Morales nodded and held a locket with 2 fingers. The kettle clicked and was silent. The room breathed at the same pace as 2 steady hearts. The city outside moved fast, but the walls kept it soft. The narrator allowed the stillness to stand. The narrator returned to the diner where Neon wrote soft lines on chrome. A bell rang once as the door eased shut. Gabriel Vance placed an envelope by the register. He named debts, one by one, and kept his voice even. Diner owner said, "You did the hours." The words were plain and kind. A coffee pot hissed and calmed. The tip jar chimed when bills slipped under coins. The clock over the grill marked the moment without rush. Gabriel Vance said, "Thank you." The counter, once bright with worry, now simply shone. The night outside nodded and moved on. The narrator stood at the estate steps at blue hour. Stone cooled under a sky that held the last light. Grace Morales climbed 1 step and paused. Gabriel Vance joined her and looked across the quiet lawn. Grace Morales said, "Gabriel." The name was no longer a secret. A window glowed above like a watchful eye, then dimmed. Somewhere inside, old rules folded and slipped into a drawer. Mara Chen waited by the drive and let the hush speak. The night settled and did not feel heavy. The echo remained clear and small, and it stayed.